It was late September when I decided to go camping out in the central part of Kansas, not far from where my great-grandparents had once lived and worked a piece of land before the Depression years. I'd been working too many hours at the office, felt boxed in by pavement and noise. I didn't want anything fancy, just me, a tent, my pack, and some space to think. The area I picked wasn't exactly a state park. It was one of those rural in-between places. Not quite public, not quite posted, but mostly just forgotten. Old, privately owned farmland that had gone feral over the last few decades. Scrubby woods, worn-down fence rows, a few forgotten sheds or silos. I parked the truck near a dry creek bed and hiked in a mile or so, just far enough to be out of earshot of the road. There wasn't much out there anymore. You could still find patches of broken fencing, rusted strands of barbed wire, the ghosts of tilled rows in the uneven land if you looked close enough. That whole region had been cleared for agriculture sometime before World War II and then abandoned again by the late 70s. The topsoil had gone thin, and the yields weren't worth the work. Most of the families who tried to hold on moved away when the co-ops shut down. I found a small clearing backed by a low, crumbling stone wall, probably an old property marker or a boundary line once. It looked like a perfect place to set up camp. Good cover, flat ground, no standing water nearby. There were even rows of corn growing nearby, not thick like a modern cornfield, but in irregular patches. It seemed strange, but I figured it might be some leftover from long ago, maybe a hybrid strain tough enough to self-seed and cling to life year after year. It wasn't unheard of. I'd seen tomatoes and even melons pop up wild before. I didn't think much of it. As I set up my tent and started to make a small fire pit, I noticed something peculiar. The corn wasn't just growing in isolation. Twisting around the stalks were climbing bean vines, old, hardy-looking vines that had clearly been growing undisturbed for a while. At the base of some of the corn plants were thick, squat leaves, squash, or maybe pumpkin. The three plants were growing together in tight, familiar clusters. It clicked in my head. This was the Three Sisters method, an old Native American companion planting technique. Corn grows tall and provides a support structure for the beans. The beans fix nitrogen into the soil that feeds the corn, and the squash sprawls across the ground, blocking weeds and conserving moisture. It was sustainable, efficient, and had been used for centuries before commercial fertilizers were a thing. Still, seeing it out here in the middle of nowhere, growing wild like that, gave me pause. The ground around the plants was strangely well kept. No major undergrowth, no trash. The soil seemed soft but not overly disturbed. I could have imagined someone maintaining it, but there wasn't any sign of human activity. No boot prints, no paths, no equipment. Felt like the plants were just there, kept alive by habit or history or maybe just luck. That night, I cooked some food over the fire and sat quietly, just listening to the wind. You don't realize how loud the city is until you spend time away from it. Out there, it was quiet in a different way, layered with small, natural sounds. Wind through the corn, insects buzzing, a distant coyote call, dry leaves shifting under some unseen animal's feet. Couldn't sleep well. The air felt heavy and close. Something about that patch of corn sat wrong in my mind. I got up around 2 a.m., just needing to move around. I didn't use a flashlight. The moon was strong, and I didn't want to disturb whatever calm was keeping that place still. I walked to the edge of the clearing where the corn rows began. The bean vines swayed slightly in the wind, brushing softly against the stalks. In the low moonlight, the leaves glowed silver, and the stalks made a soft, whispering sound. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. Then I noticed something odd. At the far edge of the corn, maybe 20 or 30 yards in, a narrow path had formed. Not cut by machines or boots, but just worn down, compacted. Like someone or something had walked that route again and again, just wide enough for one person. No human tracks, just a suggestion of passage. I followed it about 5 or 6 steps in before stopping. The rows were tight, the plants taller than me in places. I suddenly felt enclosed, boxed in by vegetation. I backed out and returned to camp. The next day, I went to investigate more thoroughly. I followed that same path again, but in daylight this time, pushing deeper into the patch. The corn grew thick around me, sometimes with beans climbing so densely that I had to peel them away to move forward. It went on for longer than I expected, maybe 50 yards in total, then ended abruptly at a large sunken area in the ground. It looked like a collapsed root cellar or a partially filled-in trench. The earth was darker there, sunken in a shape that was almost rectangular. In one corner of the depression were bones. Not many, just a few visible fragments. Small, like raccoon or possum, but scattered and old. Nearby, sprouting in a rough semicircle, were younger squash plants, too young to have formed fruit. I stood there a while, just taking it in. Something didn't add up. That kind of companion planting doesn't grow wild, not like that. You have to plant them together deliberately, space them right, guide the beans to climb, ensure the squash doesn't smother the others. Even the corn can't reseed itself efficiently without some help. It wasn't random. Someone had done this, but there was no sign of a current presence. No tools, no shelter, no bags or signs of food. Just the plants growing as if they were part of some long-standing cycle. I didn't touch anything, just walked slowly back to my tent, feeling more observed than alone. I stayed one more night, though I didn't sleep much. I heard something just after midnight, a dragging sound, like something being pulled across the dirt. I sat up in my tent, heart pounding, but didn't go out. I just waited, listening. The sound came again, slower this time. Then it stopped. I waited until sunrise before emerging. Everything looked undisturbed, but there were new tracks in the dirt. Not boots or animal prints, but dragged lines. Something heavy had been moved through the corn rows. I followed the tracks as far as I could, but they vanished into an area where the bean vines grew too thick to see the ground. I decided to leave that morning. On the hike back, I passed another overgrown field. This one filled with nothing but corn, growing wild and uneven. There were no beans, no squash, no sign of companion planting. That patch looked chaotic, like nature taking back over. I realized then how different the Three Sisters plot had felt. Orderly, intentional, as though someone had been tending it. Weeks passed after I got home, but I couldn't stop thinking about that field. I dug through old land records, using the parcel numbers from my GPS, and found the property had once belonged to a family called the Crummels. They'd farmed the area during the 1930s and were known locally for trying unusual methods. There wasn't much detail, just a couple of archived newspaper blurbs and some extension office notes from the 1940s. The farm was abandoned sometime after 1952 when the youngest son died. No heirs. The land changed hands a few times, then fell into disuse. One detail stood out, though. In one record, there was mention of rotational three-crop planting continuing beyond logical return. Another noted continued patterning of bean growth in corn rows despite lack of maintenance. It was as if the land itself remembered. Or maybe someone had kept the process going for years unnoticed. I don't camp there anymore. I still go out into the woods, still like to get away, but I stay away from farmland that's gone too quiet, where rows still form straight lines and nothing looks quite wild enough. I did one last thing a few months after my trip. I started a small garden behind my house. Just a hobby. I thought about what I'd seen out there and planted 3 crops: corn, beans, and squash. I arranged them the way I remembered: corn first, beans next to it, squash around the base. I didn't really expect much, but the first time I went out to check the plot, I saw something strange. The beans had started growing before the corn had sprouted. They had twisted and stretched out across the ground, curling blindly, trying to find something tall to climb. I hadn't staked anything yet, and yet, every morning after that, the vines had found their way to the young corn shoots and wrapped tightly, as if they remembered what to do. I didn't train them. They moved on their own. Now every season, I keep planting them. Corn, beans, squash. Not because I'm superstitious, but because the pattern seems to want to continue. Because some things, some techniques, some habits, some cycles don't die, even when the people who started them are long gone. Sometimes when I'm out there weeding, I feel like I'm not alone in the garden. Not watched exactly, but remembered. Like something in the soil is grateful the work still goes on. And I never plant them separately anymore. Not after that trip. Not after what I saw in that field. I set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. It was late summer, and the air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for weeks. Just me, some quiet time away from the city, and the chance to clear my head. The spot wasn't far off the trail, but far enough that I wouldn't get bothered by other campers or hikers. The sun was dipping low behind the trees as I finished pitching my tent, and the sky turned a soft orange pink. Right near my campsite stood a single dead tree. It looked out of place among all the green and life around it. Its bark was dry and cracked, and its branches stuck out like crooked fingers, bare and lifeless. I hadn't noticed it much when I first arrived, but now, with the fading light, it gave me a weird feeling, like it was watching. I shook the thought off and went about getting a fire going. That first night, I laid in my sleeping bag, the fire crackling softly outside my tent flap. I was half listening to the sounds of the forest, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, when I noticed a faint sound coming from the direction of the dead tree. It was soft at first, like a distant buzz, almost like the static you hear when a TV or radio isn't tuned right. The sound wasn't constant, but it came and went in short bursts. Curious, I zipped open my tent and looked towards the tree. The night was dark but clear, and the moonlight made the bare branches stand out sharply. The static noise wasn't loud enough to be more than a whisper in the quiet forest, but it definitely came from near the tree. I sat up for a while, trying to figure out what was causing it. There were no wires or any kind of electronics around. I thought maybe it was just my imagination or the way the wind was moving through the dead branches, but the sound was too consistent and clear to be just wind. Over the next few nights, the static noise became a strange routine. Each night, around the same time, the buzzing would start near the tree. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to notice. Phones and radios I brought with me would glitch and buzz if I held them close to the tree. Once, I even tried tuning my small handheld radio while standing near it. The static got so loud and harsh that the radio lost signal completely and shut off. I didn't bring much technology with me to begin with, just my phone and that radio for emergencies. Both worked fine when I moved away from the tree, but when I went back, they acted like they were being jammed. I thought maybe it was some kind of strange interference from the environment, solar activity, or a nearby transmitter I didn't know about. The forest was pretty remote, but I couldn't be sure. On the fourth night, something happened that shook me. I'd been watching the dead tree again, sitting by my fire. The static was there as usual, that low, crackling sound. I felt a strange pull towards the tree, like it was drawing me in. Against my better judgment, I stood up and walked closer. The closer I got, the louder the static became. It was almost painful in my ears. I reached out and touched the rough bark. The moment my palm pressed against the tree, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground about 20 feet away from the tree, my palms stinging and soaked with blood. I looked down and saw deep scrapes and cuts across my hands, like I'd been dragged or clawed. I checked my pockets and found a chunk of bark, roughly the size of a fist, covered in my blood. At first, I panicked, trying to remember what had happened. I didn't feel any injuries besides my hands. No bruises or cuts on my arms or legs. No bumps on my head. It was like I had just blacked out and moved without knowing it. I crawled back to my tent, heart racing, trying to make sense of it all. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, hands wrapped in cloth to stop the bleeding, watching the dead tree. The static noise was back, but quieter now, almost like it was waiting for something. I felt sick, but more than that, I felt a deep unease, like whatever was in that tree wasn't natural. I tried to convince myself it was just some weird environmental effect or a natural phenomenon I didn't understand. The next morning, I inspected the chunk of bark I found. It was dry and rough, and I could see tiny black specks in the wood, almost like burnt resin. There were no signs of insects or fungus, just old dead wood. I wondered if maybe something inside the tree had caused my blackout, like a chemical or a toxin, but I felt fine otherwise, no dizziness or nausea. I packed up my gear that day, deciding to leave. The place didn't feel safe anymore, but before I left, I did one last thing. I walked over to the tree, keeping my distance this time, and scanned the area carefully. On the ground around the base, I noticed faint scratches in the dirt. Not from an animal, but from something sharp, almost like claw marks. They weren't deep, but they were too regular to be random. The marks formed a rough circle around the tree, about 10 feet out. I backed away slowly. The sun was rising, and the forest was waking up. Birds started singing, and the air warmed up with morning light. I didn't look back as I hiked out of the clearing, the feeling in my gut telling me this was one thing I wasn't meant to figure out. Since then, I haven't camped anywhere near that spot or any dead trees like it. The static sound, the blackout, and the blood on my hands felt like a warning. Something about that tree was wrong. Something that messed with my mind and body in ways I can't explain. Maybe it was a rare natural phenomenon, maybe something else, but whatever it was, I don't want to find out what happens if I touch it again. I tell people about it now, trying to make sense of it myself, but I've never heard of anything like it, and no one believes me. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear a faint crackle in my ear, like static from a TV left on too long, and I wonder if that tree is still out there, waiting for the next person to come too close. I was out in eastern Nebraska the first time I saw a field that made me uneasy. I'd planned a solo camping trip for early October. My job was draining me dry, and I needed a few days of silence away from screens, noise, and the blur of city routines. I wanted open space, wind, and the feeling of not hearing anything human for a while. I wasn't looking for a campground or hiking trail. I wanted something forgotten, old, and left alone. I'd been looking at aerial maps and satellite imagery the week before, and I noticed a long stretch of land that used to be farmland. Patches of cleared ground boxed in by tree lines and thin creeks. It was in a triangle between a dead rural highway and some train tracks that hadn't been used in years. The place hadn't had a house on it in decades, and there were no trails or hunting blinds. No signs of anyone really going out there. It looked like a good pocket of nowhere. I parked my truck behind a shut-down grain elevator and walked about 2 miles in with my pack. The weather was just starting to turn, the dry part of fall, when the bugs die down but the snow hasn't shown up yet. Cold in the mornings, but pleasant midday. The ground was firm, the grass brittle, and the trees still holding some color. It was the kind of quiet that builds up slowly. At first, you think it's peaceful. After a while, it gets a little heavy. The land wasn't flat. It dipped and swelled in small rolling rises, the way prairie land does when it's left alone for too long. You could tell it used to be tilled. Straight lines of different soil color, subtle ridges from the plow lines, and the way the weeds didn't quite take over certain parts. There were fence posts that had rotted to nubs, and one caved-in well with rusted sheet metal half covering it. It looked like the last farmer had walked away a long time ago and never came back. I picked a spot in the middle of a clearing ringed by cottonwoods and elm, a patch of dry ground with enough cover to block the wind. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and spent most of the day just walking around and taking things in. I followed the creek bed a little, climbed a few of the higher points to see what lay out in the distance. More of the same, empty, uncultivated land. It wasn't beautiful in the traditional sense, but it was what I needed. Nothing out here was polished or planned. Just after sundown, I made a small fire and cooked some Ken stew. The sky went full black pretty quickly, and the moon hadn't risen yet, so I sat in darkness for a long while with just the glow of the coals. I could hear the dry wind combing through the grass and distant trees. Occasionally, a thump of some animal moving through the brush, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Normal sounds, natural ones. I stayed up until the cold bit at my fingers, then zipped into my sleeping bag and dozed off. I woke sometime in the night needing to piss and stepped outside the tent. My eyes adjusted to the moonlight after a minute, and I wandered off a short distance from camp. That's when I saw it. A field, low and irregular, set back behind a shallow hill. I hadn't noticed it earlier. It wasn't wide, maybe 30 by 40 feet, just large enough to be noticeable. What caught my attention was the way it looked ordered, planted, in rows. Even in the low light, I could make out tall stalks, corn clearly, mixed with vines wrapped up their lengths, and wide, flat leaves blanketing the soil at the base. It took a second to register what I was looking at. Corn, beans, squash, the old Three Sisters planting method. If I remembered right, that was an old farming technique, Native American originally, I think. Corn for the stalk, beans to climb it, and squash below to keep moisture in and weeds out. Each plant put into the soil what another took away, and they worked together like a natural cycle. It wasn't something that happened by accident. You had to plant it right, maintain it. And this patch was thriving. That set off a quiet alarm in my head. The land around me was unkempt, abandoned, and rough. This patch of crops was healthy, organized, as if someone had planted it this past spring, cared for it during the summer, and left it to finish out the season. But there were no tire tracks, no signs of tools, no fencing, nothing modern. Just this perfect little garden sitting where no one would ever expect to find it. I walked a few steps closer, inspecting the nearest corn stalks. The beans had grown high and spiraled tight, not wildly but purposefully. The squash leaves were massive, blotting out the dirt entirely. Some of the fruit was ready to harvest, light green squash, unpicked. It was as if the field had grown untouched for weeks, maybe months, but not wild, just ignored. I didn't go any closer. Something about it unnerved me in a way I couldn't put into words. The air smelled different near it too, damp and thick like overripe plants rotting in the heat, though the night was cool. I backed away and returned to my tent. I zipped in and lay there for hours, not sure why my mind kept circling back to that patch of land. The next morning, I returned in daylight. The field looked even more out of place in full view. The rows were clean, no weeds, and the plants were spaced too evenly to be the work of birds or wind. Someone had planted this, no doubt in my mind, but there were no signs of tools or equipment, not even footprints in the soft dirt. Just the plants themselves, looking healthy but oddly untouched. I walked the perimeter. On the far end, there was a spot where the soil was darker, almost black, and slightly sunken. Not like a hole, more like the ground had collapsed just enough to notice. I poked around with a stick but didn't hit anything solid. It was loamy, soft, smelled rich like compost. I didn't dig. Something in my gut told me to leave it alone. There were small bones scattered near that part of the field. Not a lot, just a few. Looked like raccoon, maybe a possum. Could have been natural, but they were close together and clean, like something had arranged them or at least not disturbed them for a long time. I started feeling watched, even though I knew there was nobody out there. I checked again later that afternoon. Still no signs of recent human presence. No boot prints, no trash, no breaks in the brush. But the field looked just as clean, just as planned. That night, I sat up later than usual. I didn't want to go to sleep. The field had my mind locked in. The thought that someone had planted it and left, that was plausible. But the fact that it had been so well maintained without evidence of anyone returning, that unsettled me. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise I couldn't explain. It was like dragging, maybe cloth on dirt or something being pulled. Came from the direction of the field. I didn't get out of the tent. I just lay there listening. It went on for a few minutes, drag, pause, drag again, then stopped. In the morning, I found a line in the dirt about 2 inches deep, running from the edge of the field to behind one of the trees on the hill. No footprints, just the line, like something heavy had been pulled or had moved on its own. A single straight groove. I followed it for a bit, but it ended at a patch of old grass. Nothing else around. I packed up early that day. The place didn't feel right anymore. I left the tent standing and hiked out, telling myself I'd come back for it later, but I never did. Back at home, I couldn't let it go. I started researching the area. The land had once belonged to a family named Heller in the 1920s. They were known locally for old planting methods. One article mentioned they stuck with intercropping traditions, even as others shifted to more modern techniques. They were listed in an old farming newsletter from 1931, describing their use of corn, beans, and squash in a method passed down generations. The article called it a living cycle in the soil. The Hellers vanished from records after 1956. No sale, no obituary, no forwarding address. Just stopped appearing. Their land went unclaimed and was later marked as unfit for development due to soil instability and unreliable groundwater. Eventually, it was just removed from use, like it slipped off the map. Every now and then, I pull up the area on satellite view. That same field shows up faintly, darker than the ground around it, still roughly the same size and shape. No roads lead to it, no development nearby. It's still growing year after year. I haven't gone back. The last thing I'll say is this. I tried planting the same thing in my backyard a season later. Just a small plot, corn, beans, squash. Same order. I wanted to see how it would go. The corn came up thin and fell over. The beans never climbed. The squash sprouted and then died before flowering. Nothing worked, not even close. But out there, in that forgotten field, something still knows how to do it right. I don't know if it's the soil, the history, or something deeper in the ground, but that cycle keeps going. Something keeps it going, and I won't disturb it again. I took a week off work in early September and drove out to stay on a piece of land that my friend Jake had bought a few years back but never really did anything with. He got it cheap through an auction. It used to be an old farm property in northern Missouri, about 40 acres of overgrown land with an old barn, some cleared pastures now thick with weeds, and the bare outline of a house foundation. The house had burned down long before he bought the place. All that was left was part of the stone chimney and some cinder blocks that bordered where the kitchen used to be. He offered to let me camp there if I wanted. I like solitude, and this seemed like the perfect place for it. I loaded up my gear, a cooler of food, and planned to stay from Monday to Friday. I had books, firewood, and a small solar charger for my phone, though I didn't expect any service out there. I was fine with that. The land was remote, 2 miles down a gravel road, then another half-mile along a rutted trail barely wide enough for a truck. At the end of that trail, you passed between 2 leaning fence posts and came out onto an open field ringed with trees. I set up my tent near the barn, close enough to shelter if it rained, but far enough from the old structure that it wouldn't be a risk if it collapsed. It was quiet. No houses in sight, no sound of cars, just wind and insects and the occasional bird call. On the first day, I explored. The land sloped gently downward toward the east, and a thin creek cut along the edge of the property. I followed it until I hit a thick grove of trees, mostly maple, some hickory. Near the center of the property was a wide clearing, maybe the size of a football field, where the grass had grown much shorter. You could tell it had been cultivated at some point in the past. The soil there was darker and the ground more even. On the far end of that clearing, I found something strange. It was a patch of earth about 30 feet long and maybe 15 feet wide. Crops were growing there, fresh, thriving plants. Corn stood in rows, tall and green. Vines spiraled up the stalks. Beans, clearly, and below them were spreading leaves, pale green with jagged edges. Squash. I stared at it for a long time, confused. There were no signs of tools, no buckets, no wheelbarrow. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and this land was landlocked and unused. Jake hadn't said anything about someone else being out there, and from what I could tell, nobody had touched the rest of the property in years. But someone or something had planted this field, carefully, skillfully. I remembered a bit about this setup from something I'd read long ago. It was an old farming method, a companion planting technique used by Native Americans. Corn gave the beans something to climb. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil for the corn. Squash covered the ground and blocked weeds while keeping moisture in. All three helped each other grow. It was smart, efficient. So no, it wasn't a horror story. It was just a farming technique. But it still didn't make sense that this would be here, alone, unattended. I knelt and touched the dirt. It was soft, rich, not dry like the surrounding ground. A faint smell of damp soil and plant sap lingered in the air. Someone had tended this land, not just once, recently, maybe even still. I walked the perimeter and looked for tracks, but found nothing. No boot prints, no animal tracks, no broken branches or trails leading in or out. It was like the garden just appeared. That night, I made a small fire by the barn and heated up some food. I kept thinking about the field. I told myself it was probably just an old garden that had somehow reseeded itself. Or maybe a nearby farmer had decided to try a personal crop on some extra land and never told Jake. That made some sense. Kind of. But even that explanation had holes. The plants were healthy. Too healthy. No weeds, no insects on the leaves. No signs of disease. It looked more like a display than a real wild garden. The second day, I spent more time walking around. I marked trees, measured distances, and kept an eye out for anything unusual. By mid-afternoon, I decided to check out the barn. It was falling apart, one corner completely caved in, but the other end still stood strong enough to poke through. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dried hay. There were rusted tools on the wall, a half-broken plow, a cracked bucket, some animal feed bags that had turned to dust. What stood out was a pile of crates in the back, stacked carefully in a corner under a thick tarp. When I pulled it back, I saw that the top crate was filled with dried corn cobs. Below that, another had empty jars, some with yellowed labels. I couldn't make out the writing, but a few had drawings of beans and squash. The dates on the lids were from the late 90s. It was clear someone had been out here more recently than I thought. Someone had stored seeds. Someone had planted. But again, who and why here? Later that night, as the sun was going down, I decided to walk back to the field one more time before it got dark. The garden looked the same. Perfect rows. No damage. No signs of animals feeding. But something was different. The soil near the center looked recently disturbed. The ground was slightly lower, and a faint depression stretched across one row of corn. I knelt and pressed my palm against it. Cold. Damp. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing small noises. Scratches, soft thumps, maybe a branch cracking. Could have been wind, could have been animals, but it made me uneasy. The fire died down quicker than usual, and the cold settled in fast. By morning, I was groggy and unsure what to do. I still had 2 days left, but I was losing the calm I'd come here to find. The field stuck in my thoughts like a splinter. I decided to dig. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to understand what was going on. I brought a small hand trowel with me and walked back to the garden around 9 a.m. I went to the spot where the soil had looked disturbed the night before and began to dig slowly, trying not to damage the roots. The dirt was rich and soft, and it came away easily. About a foot down, I hit something. Not a rock, not wood, something harder, smoother. I brushed the soil aside and saw the edge of a bone. My stomach tightened. I kept digging, carefully. Within minutes, I uncovered what looked like a ribcage. Human, too large to be animal. The bones were discolored, darkened with age, but intact. There was no clothing, no fabric, no sign of tools or personal belongings. Just the bones, packed deep into the soft earth beneath the corn. I stepped back and stared. My first thought was to report it, call the sheriff, but I had no cell service, and the nearest station was miles away. I also had no proof I hadn't put the bones there. My prints were everywhere now. My shovel, my tracks, no witnesses. Panic set in, then slowly gave way to a colder feeling, realization. This wasn't an accident. The soil here was dark because it had been fed. The crops were thriving because this ground had been enriched the old-fashioned way. Not with fertilizer, with decomposition, with what was left behind. That's why the beans climbed so well, why the corn stood tall, why the squash spread so thick. This wasn't just a farming technique. It was something older than that, something closer to a cycle. Plant, grow, feed, repeat. Whoever had planted this field had done so more than once, and the soil got better each time. I covered the bones back up. I didn't know what else to do. I returned to the barn, packed my gear, and left within the hour. I didn't even bother to clean up my campsite. I just drove. I haven't gone back since. A few months later, I asked Jake again if anyone else had access to that land. He said no. Nobody had keys, and the place hadn't been touched since he bought it. I didn't tell him what I found. I didn't mention the bones or the field. I let him believe it was just an old farm with nothing special about it. But I know the truth now. That garden isn't an accident. Someone used to live there, and they fed the land with more than just compost. Whether they were desperate, insane, or part of something I don't understand, I'll never know. What I do know is this. When someone says, "Yeah, this isn't a horror story, bro, it's a farming technique," they're not wrong. It is a farming technique. But sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's the simple fact that nature always finds a way to keep growing, even if it has to use you to do it. And that patch of corn, beans, and squash still grows every season, even though nobody's planted it since. I planned to go alone. I had all the basics: tent, stove, food, first aid, a good knife, topo maps, GPS, a backup compass. I told a friend the general area I'd be in and set out for a 5-day stay. I parked at a trailhead near Mackenzie Pass, loaded up my pack, and hiked in along a lesser-used trail that wrapped around the base of the North Sister. It was rough and faded in places, but I liked that. No crowds. The first day went fine. I made it about 7 miles in, past a dry stream bed, and pitched my tent near a fallen pine. The air was thin but fresh. I remember eating something simple, jerky and rice, and crawling into my sleeping bag early. That night, there were no strange sounds, just wind in the trees and the occasional groan from my pack shifting under its own weight. The second day, I kept moving uphill. I wanted to reach a plateau I'd seen on the map, tucked between 2 glacial shelves. It was supposed to be flat and dry, a good place to set up a base camp for a couple of days. Around mid-afternoon, I got there. The view was incredible. Miles of scrubland and old lava flows below, jagged snow patches on the high ridges above. It was quiet and still in a way you don't get in regular life. No engines, no voices, just air, stone, and time. I set up my camp in a shallow depression shielded by boulders, maybe 50 yards from the edge of a slope that dropped off steeply toward the old volcanic basin. I boiled water, made a dehydrated meal, and settled in. It was good. Exactly the kind of stillness I'd come out there for. The first odd thing happened the next morning. I woke up before the sun crested the ridge, crawled out of my tent, and noticed something strange. There were small piles of stone nearby, 3 of them, maybe 6 feet apart, lined up neatly in a row. Each was made of stacked rocks, no more than a foot tall. I hadn't seen them when I arrived the day before. I was sure of that. The ground was otherwise bare. I didn't know what to think. Could have been other campers. But I hadn't seen any tracks on the trail coming in. The ground around my camp was undisturbed, and those piles were only about 10 or 15 feet from my tent. I figured maybe I'd missed them somehow. Maybe they'd always been there. Just a weird coincidence. I took some photos with my phone, checked my bearings, and decided to do a loop hike that day, up to a small glacial pool about 2 miles north. It was a steep climb, and halfway there I turned my ankle stepping across a loose patch of rock. Not bad enough to stop me, but enough that I had to slow down. The terrain was tricky, lots of uneven ground, big boulders, and deadfall hidden under patches of alpine scrub. I reached the pool around noon, rested a while, then headed back. Clouds had started building by then, and the wind shifted. The air felt different, heavier. By the time I got back to camp, I was cold, tired, and limping more than I wanted to admit. The 3 rock piles were still there, but they were different. Slightly. The middle one was taller. I was almost certain of it. 1 or 2 more stones added. I walked over, stared at them, then checked the photos on my phone. I zoomed in, compared the angles. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been at my camp while I was gone. I checked my gear, nothing missing, nothing touched. The tent was zipped, my food was sealed, the fire pit was undisturbed. But the stones had been changed. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about those rocks. Who had been up there? I hadn't seen a soul in 2 days. No signs, no other camps, no movement across the ridgelines. I got up twice in the night and looked around with my flashlight. The piles were still there, unchanged. By the 4th day, I was feeling off. The ankle was stiff, and I had a dull headache that pulsed behind my eyes. I thought it might be the elevation. I drank more water, stretched, and made a plan to pack out the next day. I didn't want to stay another night. I spent most of the day resting, sitting on a rock ledge and watching clouds move, reading a bit, trying to convince myself there was a simple explanation for the rocks. Maybe I had done it, or imagined the difference. I was alone, tired, maybe my brain was playing tricks. But then I found something else. Just before sundown, I walked 100 yards downslope to scout a possible alternate trail out. I passed through a narrow gap between boulders and came into a small hollow. There were more rock piles, 3 of them again. Different shapes this time, longer, almost like lines instead of stacks. They were fresh. The soil beneath them was darker, less dusty. Whoever made them had done it recently. I backed out of that hollow fast. My breathing picked up, and I felt something cold in my gut. Not fear exactly, but instinct, like I had walked in on something I wasn't supposed to see. Back at camp, I ate a cold meal, no fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I tightened the cords on my tent, pulled my gear close, and sat up with my back to a boulder until well after dark. The moon came up late, casting sharp shadows across the ridge. Everything looked like it was watching me. At some point, I dozed off. Not long, maybe 30 minutes. But when I opened my eyes, I knew something had changed again. The piles were gone. All 3 of them, the ones 10 feet from my tent. I grabbed my light, scanned the area. Nothing. Flat dirt. No rocks. No sign they had ever been there. But I knew they had. I had the photos. I had stood right next to them. They were gone now. That was it for me. I packed my essentials into my day pack, left the tent behind, and started down the trail before first light. I limped hard on the ankle, but I pushed. I wanted out. About halfway back to the car, I crossed a dry creek and noticed something that stopped me cold. 3 fresh footprints in the silt. Bare feet, adult size. I looked around. No prints leading in. No prints leading out. Just 3 steps, like someone had stood there watching. I kept moving. Didn't stop again until I reached my truck. Tossed my gear in the back, slammed the door, and drove. I didn't even take off my boots. Didn't check the rearview mirror. I just drove until I hit the highway. I've camped a lot. Seen weird stuff, animals, lights, weather, but nothing like that. No sounds, no voices, no figures. Just things placed where they shouldn't be. Moved without explanation. Always in 3s. I don't know who did it. I don't know why. Maybe it was some survivalist group marking territory. Maybe some backwoods ritual I stumbled across. Maybe something older than that, something passed down, never written, only done. But I do know one thing. The 3 sisters isn't just a name. It's not just mountains. Someone or something up there uses that name for something else. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe it's literal. 3 piles, 3 shapes, 3 marks, always 3. And maybe I was lucky I left when I did, because the piles weren't just random. They were getting closer. First 15 feet away, then 10, then gone. Maybe the next step was right at my door. I haven't gone back. I won't. Whatever's up there doesn't want company. And next time, they might not just leave rocks. I've been trying to get out of the city for weeks. Life had started to feel cramped, like the walls were closing in slowly without me noticing. The noise, the traffic, the endless stream of people. I needed out. I looked over maps of state parks and national forests within a day's drive and finally settled on a lesser-known area out in eastern Nebraska. It wasn't the kind of place people usually camped. No major trails, no services, not much of anything except flat land and old tree lines. That's what I liked about it. The place used to be farmland, long abandoned. Some parts had been bought up by the state, maybe to be restored eventually, but most of it was just empty fields with patchy woods between them. I figured I could hike in a couple of miles from the gravel road, set up camp under some trees, and spend a few days reading, walking, and getting away from everything. I packed light but well. Tent, small stove, plenty of water, freeze-dried meals, maps, compass, backup phone battery, flashlight, basic med kit. I brought an old book on soil and land use too, something I picked up years ago when I was briefly interested in small-scale farming. I didn't know why I grabbed it, but it ended up being the only book in my truck when I left. The drive was long and flat. Endless cornfields rolled past until even the corn disappeared and it was just open sky and dry soil. I parked off an old service road, locked the truck, shouldered my pack, and started walking west toward the tree line in the distance. The area was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dry grass under my boots. The ground had that strange look, like it used to be worked hard by machines and people but hadn't been touched in years. Straight lines in the soil still marked where rows of something once grew. Fences leaned at broken angles, and there were signs of old irrigation ditches half filled with silt and weeds. I reached the woods by mid-afternoon and found a spot near a cluster of elm trees. The trees gave decent shade, and there was a shallow slope just behind me that offered some protection from the wind. I pitched the tent, took a quick walk around to get my bearings, and came back to heat a meal. I ate fast and sat back against the tree, watching the sky turn orange as the sun dropped low. The air got cooler fast. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that almost makes you forget you're alone. That night I slept well. No noises, no animals brushing up against the tent, just wind and distant rustling. But when I woke up the next morning and stepped outside to stretch, I noticed something strange. Right next to my tent, maybe 3 feet away, there were 3 small holes in the ground, each about the size of a baseball, evenly spaced in a perfect line. The soil around them looked freshly turned. At first I thought they might be some kind of animal tracks, but the holes were too clean, too intentional. I crouched down and poked a stick into one of them, a few inches deep, just holes. No debris, no obvious purpose. They were definitely new. I'd walked through that exact spot the night before. They hadn't been there then. I didn't know what to think, so I made breakfast and tried to ignore it. Maybe an animal had done it during the night, some kind of foraging behavior. I made a mental note to check for prints or signs of digging, but didn't see much else. Later that day, I took a walk south through the woods, following the edge of a field. I found an old rusted-out tractor half buried in tall grass, and nearby, I spotted a stretch of what looked like collapsed fence posts. Beyond that, there was a section of land that had clearly once been cultivated. The soil had that soft, pillowy look, light brown, broken up by old furrows that were still faintly visible. I crouched to look at the patterns and noticed something that clicked a memory in my head. 3 small indentations spaced out in a triangle. It looked like someone had planted something deliberately. Corn, beans, and squash maybe? It reminded me of something I read in that soil book, something about companion planting. The 3 sisters, I think it was called. Corn provides a stalk for beans to climb. Beans fix nitrogen into the soil. Squash shades the ground to keep weeds down. It was an old technique used by native farmers. Efficient, sustainable, low maintenance. That made sense out here. Maybe someone had tried it long ago. I walked back to camp later, thinking about that, and saw something that made my chest tighten. More holes. 3 more, perfectly spaced, right on the other side of my tent. I hadn't noticed them when I left. The ground was still slightly damp, like it had been dug recently. No footprints, no animals, just holes. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, listening for sounds, snapping branches, breathing, anything. Nothing came. But when I unzipped the tent in the morning, the holes were gone, filled in. The soil was packed flat, and there were no signs they'd ever been there, just smooth ground with a few blades of grass on top. I stared for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. I even crouched and brushed the dirt with my hand, looking for signs of disturbance. Nothing. I got up, backed away, and walked a slow circle around my camp. Then I saw them again. Further out this time, 3 holes maybe 20 feet away in the direction of the field. Still in that exact triangular spacing. Still fresh. Something was being done. Repeated. Watched. I took out the soil book and reread the section on companion planting. The spacing of the crops. The benefit of each to the others. It was just farming, but now it felt wrong. Like someone was trying to start a planting cycle here again. But who? And why around me? It occurred to me that someone might be using this area for experiments, or even illegal crops. Maybe they were trying to plant something in secret and saw me as an intruder. But if that were true, why mark the ground around my tent? Why get so close? And why do it silently, without a trace? I didn't want to panic, but I started packing some of my gear into my backpack just in case. I figured if something felt off again the next morning, I'd leave a day early. The fourth day started strange and stayed that way. I woke up before sunrise, even though I hadn't meant to. The tent felt too warm, almost like someone had placed something over it. When I stepped outside, I found small mounds of soil around the camp. 3 again. This time, not holes, mounds, like something had been planted. Each mound was slightly raised, maybe 4 or 5 inches high, with a small depression in the middle like someone had pressed a seed into it. Still the same spacing, still the same triangle, and still no signs of footsteps, tools, or anyone else. That was it. I didn't eat. I didn't clean up camp. I packed my bag, zipped it, and started walking back toward the road. I didn't run, but I didn't move slow either. Every sound behind me made me stop and look, but there was never anything there. When I reached the truck, I threw the gear inside, turned the key, and didn't stop until I was 2 towns away. I found a motel, paid in cash, and sat in the room for over an hour trying to calm down. That night, I opened the soil book again, looked at the page about the 3 sisters. I ran a finger over the diagram showing corn, beans, and squash, spaced in a triangle. Same as what I saw, but something stuck out. There was a sentence at the bottom of the page, one I hadn't noticed before. It said, "The companion method thrives in isolation. Once established, the pattern will repeat itself if the soil is right and the cycle uninterrupted." I shut the book and stared at the ceiling. Whatever I walked into out there wasn't a ghost story or a fairy tale. It wasn't some creature lurking in the trees. It was a system, process, maybe old, maybe forgotten, but still running. Maybe someone had once used those fields to plant in that way. Maybe they had lived out there. Maybe they never stopped. Or maybe the land had taken the method into itself like muscle memory and was repeating it. Dig, plant, grow. The thing that unsettled me the most wasn't that the holes appeared. It was how they responded to me. I slept there and they showed up closer. I moved around and they shifted with me. Something was watching the pattern. Not in a human way, in a patient, automatic way. Farming doesn't need a face to keep going. It just needs land, time, and the right conditions. And I think I was just one more thing the cycle adjusted for. I haven't gone back. I probably won't. But sometimes, when I go walking through parks near my home, I look down at the dirt, and every once in a while, I see a triangle of depressions in the soil. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's the start of something. Again. I usually go camping a couple times a year, mostly solo. I work construction most of the time, a job that burns me out pretty good. So when I get a chance to take a long weekend, I pack up my gear and get lost for a few days. No people, no phones, no cars. Just the woods and whatever I carry in on my back. I don't go to organized campgrounds. I find my own spot, deep enough in that I don't hear anyone else. I keep it simple: tent, tarp, sleeping bag, a knife, stove, and a few days of food. Last fall, I took a trip a few counties south of where I live, near an old service road I'd been down before but never really explored. It had been used decades ago for timber operations and maybe some small farms, but now it was mostly overgrown and forgotten. The forest, there is a mix of pine and old hardwoods, heavy undergrowth, and barely any trails. I picked a weekend in October when the air was cool and the days were still long enough to hike. I packed up Friday morning and drove out, aiming to park at the edge of the service road and walk in 4 or 5 miles. I knew from the topo maps that there were some clearings scattered deeper in, spots that probably used to be farmland. That's what I was aiming for. I like those areas, usually flat, easier to set up camp, and the soil's dry and packed. If you've been in enough woods, you start to recognize the signs. Stone piles from old fences, odd rows of trees, unnatural clearings that don't quite match the surrounding forest. I've even found old machinery once, rusted and half-buried. I reached the trailhead just after noon. No other cars around. I threw on my pack and started down the road. The first mile or two was pretty quiet. Just birds, wind through the branches, and the crunch of gravel under my boots. After a while, the old road got harder to follow. Weeds grew thick between the ruts, and saplings had started taking over. I followed it for another couple hours, then turned off and went cross-country toward one of the old clearings I'd marked on my GPS. When I reached it, it was better than I expected. A big rectangle of open space, flat and wide, probably close to half a football field in size. A few tall weeds, but mostly bare soil with scattered grass. On the edges, I could see rows of old trees planted in lines, maybe windbreaks or orchard remnants. I dropped my pack, looked around for a while, and then set up camp on the north side near the trees. I staked my tent, laid out my sleeping pad, and started boiling water for a quick meal. As I walked the perimeter to stretch my legs, I noticed something weird about the ground. Some of the dirt looked darker, richer, almost tilled. Not recently, but it held a softness that felt different from the hard-packed soil around it. I bent down and ran my hand across it. It was loose like garden soil, even though it had weeds growing through it. There were several small square patches like that, each maybe 3 feet wide and spaced about 10 feet apart, like plots in a vegetable garden. It reminded me of something my uncle used to say when I was a kid. He had a garden behind his place and always joked that people used to plant beans in bodies. Said the decomposing flesh fed the plants better than any fertilizer. It was just some old man talk meant to make me squirm. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but standing in that clearing with rows of strange, soft dirt, it flicked back into my mind. Still, I shook it off. I was tired from the hike and probably overthinking it. I made dinner, cleaned up, and sat on a stump near my tent while the sun dipped low behind the trees. The quiet was deep, no road noise, no planes, just that low ambient rustle you get in deep woods. After a while, I crawled into my tent, zipped up, and drifted off. Sometime in the night, I woke up, not from a sound exactly, but from that feeling you get when something's off. My body was still, but my mind kicked awake hard. I laid there listening. Nothing, just the occasional pop of a cooling tree branch. I listened for a while longer and then I heard it, a soft thump, followed by what sounded like dirt being moved. Not fast or frantic, just slow, steady scraping. It was close. My tent walls were thin, and there was no wind, so the sound carried. It sounded like something was moving soil. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pinpoint it. It was coming from maybe 20 feet away, same area where I'd seen those square patches of dark soil. I waited. The sound kept going, then stopped. Silence. Then another thump, and another. I didn't unzip the tent. I laid there, stiff and listening, for at least an hour. Eventually, I fell asleep again. When I woke up, the light was gray and dull. I crawled out of the tent and walked over to where I'd heard the sound. My breath caught. One of the square patches had changed. The soil had been disturbed. A small mound had been added to the center, shaped like a cone, maybe a foot tall. It wasn't there the day before. It looked fresh. No weeds, loose dirt, just bare soil. No prints, no shovel marks, just a clean pile. It looked deliberate. I stood there staring for a long time. I circled the mound slowly, scanning the ground around it. Nothing. No trash, no signs of wildlife, no tools. Whatever had been done, it had been done cleanly. I poked the mound gently with a stick. The soil collapsed inward a bit, like it was hollow inside, but I didn't dig further. Something felt off. I'm not the kind of guy who spooks easy, but this wasn't normal. It wasn't erosion. It wasn't natural. It was placed. I went about my day trying to shake it off. I hiked a loop through the woods, maybe 6 or 7 miles, just to burn off the nerves. I came back late in the afternoon. The mound was still there, unchanged. I made dinner, kept a fire going until dusk, then sat with my back to the tent, facing the clearing, just watching. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, soft, regular, like digging again. But now it came from multiple spots, not just one. Like there were several small digging motions happening slowly and in shifts. I stayed in my tent, too tense to move. At sunrise, I forced myself to get up. My limbs were sore from staying still so long. I stepped out and looked across the clearing. 2 more mounds had appeared. Same size, same shape, same spacing. One near the first, and another about 10 yards away. All 3 looked fresh, clean, intentional. I felt my stomach tighten. I scanned the edges of the clearing, looking for any signs that someone else had been there. Footprints, broken twigs, cigarette butts. Nothing. It was as if the mounds had risen on their own. But I knew they hadn't. Something or someone was doing this. I packed my bag. Not a full pack out, but enough that I could move quickly if I needed to. I left my tent standing and hiked a half-mile toward the next ridge to get signal. I held up my phone on the highest point. 2 bars. Enough. I opened my maps and dropped a pin at my location, just in case. I didn't text anyone. I didn't make a call. I just kept the map up and hiked back slowly. When I got back to camp, something stopped me cold. The tent was gone. Not torn, not collapsed. Gone. I walked to where it had been, heart pounding, and found the ground bare. No drag marks, no stakes, no shredded fabric. My gear that had been inside, sleeping bag, pad, clothes gone too. In its place, dead center, was another mound. Larger, wider base, maybe 5 feet across. Same shape, tidy, packed clean. My legs felt like rubber. I scanned the forest around me, eyes twitching at every movement. Nothing moved. The sun was still high, maybe 3 in the afternoon. I knew I had time to hike out, but it would be close. I had a choice. Stay another night and keep watch, or cut my losses and hike back with the gear I had. I chose to leave. I didn't run, but I didn't walk slow either. My knife stayed in my hand the whole time. I hiked hard, straight through to the road, checking behind me every few hundred feet. I reached my truck at sunset, tossed my pack in the bed, and got the hell out of there. I didn't tell anyone, at least not in detail. People don't believe you when you say something's wrong, but you can't explain why. They want a culprit, a reason, a threat. But I didn't have one. Just dirt and silence and things left behind. A few months later, I checked satellite imagery for that clearing. It hadn't changed. Still a rectangle, still untouched from above. But I knew what was under those trees. I knew what those mounds were. Not graves, not really. Just soil worked by patient hands. I don't know who or why. I don't know if they were living out some twisted idea of farming or trying to send a message to whoever wandered in. All I know is someone was maintaining those patches like garden beds. And when I showed up, I became part of the layout. Like I'd been planted there. Like I was supposed to sprout. No ghosts, no magic. Just someone out there doing something quiet and strange, and covering the evidence with tidy mounds of dirt. I don't go camping alone anymore. I've been going on solo camping trips since I was 20, maybe a little younger. There's something about being out there alone that clears my head in a way nothing else does. No pressure to talk. No phones. Just trees, wind, and time stretching out in front of you. I usually pick places that are remote but legal, state forests, public use lands, places with no real trails or campsites, just endless woods and a few dirt roads if you're lucky. I carry what I need and nothing more. Tent, food, water, knife, headlamp, first aid kit, and fire starting gear. I'm careful. I don't push beyond my limits. This happened in the late fall of 2022. I'd gotten a few days off work at the last second and decided to make the most of it. I picked a stretch of forest a couple hours north of where I lived, up near the state line. It was land owned by a timber company but open to public access. Not well known, not marked, no trailheads, just logging roads and a few pull-offs that hunters and four-wheelers use. I'd found the area while looking at topographic maps and noticed a string of small ponds and ridges tucked way off the road system. It looked quiet, isolated, and untouched. Exactly what I wanted. I left early one morning, got coffee on the way, and reached the area around 10. I drove down gravel roads for a while until I found a wide enough shoulder to park without blocking anything. There were no other vehicles around. The air was cool, maybe low 50s, with just a bit of wind that moved through the tops of the trees. I loaded my pack, locked the truck, and walked in on foot. The first few hours were calm. I hiked in around 4 or 5 miles through old pine stands and mixed hardwoods. Most of the leaves had fallen, which made the forest floor noisy and hard to move through quietly. Every step was a crunch. I crossed 2 small creeks and eventually reached a narrow ridge that looked out over a low valley. That's where I decided to camp, on high ground with a good view close enough to water. The spot was ideal. There was a natural clearing just under a big oak, and it looked like no one had used it in years. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, and took some time to gather dead wood for a fire. As the sun dropped, the temperature followed. By nightfall, it was maybe in the high 30s. I sat by the fire, cooked a simple meal, and watched the last light drain from the valley below. I remember thinking how peaceful it all felt, how quiet, how removed from everything. That night, I slept light. I usually do on the first night of a trip. Every small noise snaps me halfway awake, and I lie there listening until I drift off again. Around midnight, I woke up completely. No idea why, no dream, no noise, just wide awake, staring into the dark of the tent. I stayed like that for a few minutes, just breathing and listening. The wind had picked up a little, rustling through the dry leaves. Then I heard something new. A faint crack, like a twig snapping under weight, came from downhill in the valley. I stayed still, straining to listen. After a few seconds, another sound followed. Less a step, more like something dragging or brushing against the ground. Not fast, not loud, just present. I sat up, slowly unzipped my sleeping bag, and reached for the knife I keep beside me. I didn't move outside the tent. I've learned not to do that unless I'm certain of what I'm hearing. Animals are always moving at night. Deer, raccoons, even bear. But something about the way this moved didn't feel natural. It wasn't skittish, it wasn't quiet, but it wasn't crashing through either. Just slow, steady movement. Then it stopped. The wind blew again, louder this time, and I lost the sound in it. After maybe 10 minutes of nothing, I laid back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning was cold. I made coffee and sat by the fire trying to shake the tension. The woods felt different, like they were holding something tight. I chalked it up to nerves. A night alone in the middle of nowhere can do that to you. After breakfast, I hiked a loop down into the valley. I wanted to see if there were any prints or signs of movement. The leaves made tracking hard, but I scanned anyway. About 200 yards downhill, near one of the ponds I'd seen on the map, I found a patch where the leaves had been moved aside. Not by wind, by something heavy. It looked like a wide, flat swath had been dragged or scraped, maybe 2 feet across, over 10 feet long. No clear footprints, just that disturbed area. I knelt to look closer and noticed something small near the edge of the scrape. A piece of cloth, faded green, maybe nylon. It looked like the corner of a torn strap or something similar, frayed at the edge. I picked it up. It felt old but not weathered enough to have been there for years. I put it in my pocket without thinking. Back at camp, I couldn't stop looking at that piece of fabric. I kept it in my hand, turning it over, trying to place what it could have come from. A backpack? A tent bag? It didn't look like any kind of hunting gear I recognized. I felt a slow, sinking unease start to grow. Not fear exactly, just that sense you get when something doesn't sit right. That night, I built a bigger fire and kept it going as long as I could. I didn't eat much. I kept checking the woods with my headlamp, scanning between the trees. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard something, but I never saw anything. I got into the tent late, close to midnight, and kept my boots on. I laid there, blade in hand, just listening. It didn't take long. The noise came back. First, it was the brush, soft, deliberate movement. Then the dragging sound, same as the night before, came from the same direction, but this time it got closer. I could hear individual steps, heavy and spaced apart. Something was walking uphill. Slowly, I shut off my headlamp and stayed perfectly still. It stopped maybe 30 feet from my tent. I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. The fire had gone out completely. There was no moon. I couldn't see anything through the tent walls. Then I heard it, a low, steady breathing. Not panting, not snorting, just slow breaths. I stood there, breathing, for what felt like forever. Then one final sound, a distinct crunch. Not a twig, not a leaf. It sounded like fabric tearing under strain. I held my breath, then silence. Whatever it was, it left. I didn't sleep after that. The first light, I packed. I didn't eat. I didn't look for tracks. I stuffed everything into my bag as fast as I could. Took one last look at the clearing and started moving. I hiked the same way I came, making sure I followed my GPS points exactly. The woods felt even more off than before. Too quiet, like everything had cleared out. 3 miles in, I stopped to drink water. That's when I noticed something. A tree about 20 feet off the trail had deep cuts in the bark. Not claw marks, scrapes, long and straight, like someone had run a sharp tool vertically up the trunk. There were 5 or 6 of them, evenly spaced. They weren't old either. Fresh wood was visible beneath. I moved on. Another mile and I saw another tree. Same thing. I saw a third just before reaching the road. I didn't stop that time. I moved fast, almost jogged the last stretch to the truck. When I reached it, the passenger side mirror was bent in. No scratches, no broken glass. Just folded tight against the door like someone had pushed it by hand. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and drove. Took me weeks to talk myself down from that trip. I told myself it was an animal, or a poacher, or some local messing around. But none of that made sense. Animals don't leave drag marks like that. Poachers don't breathe outside your tent and leave tree markings like a warning. And locals don't follow you through miles of dense forest just to tear a mirror off a truck and disappear. The piece of fabric I found? I still have it. I checked it again the night I got home. This military green with stitching that looks hand-done. Not manufactured. No brand. No print. Just fabric, frayed and cold to the touch. I haven't been back to that forest since. I still camp, but closer to home. Closer to people. What scares me isn't what I heard or saw. It's what I didn't. Whatever was out there wasn't trying to hurt me. It was trying to scare me away. And it worked. I've always liked telling stories around the fire when I camp. I go out alone most of the time, but when I do end up with a few friends or a couple strangers in a shared spot, I usually bring one story out that always gets attention. It's about El Silban, the Whistler, a folk legend from Venezuela. I'm not Venezuelan, but I heard it from a friend years ago, and it stuck with me. They say the Whistler roams the roads at night, especially in cold, dark, remote places. You hear the whistle loud at first, like it's right beside you, but the quieter it gets, the closer he is. Once it's faint, almost gone, that means he's right next to you. He carries the skulls of his victims and counts them, and if you don't listen to every count, someone in your family dies soon after. People say he wears a straw hat, tattered clothes, and his face looks like death. It's not the scariest story, but something about it always gets under your skin when you're miles from anywhere, just firelight and woods. It gets people quiet, listening. I told that story one weekend deep in the jungle region of southern Colombia. I'd been working my way through South America on foot and by bus, traveling cheap, camping when I could, hostels when I had to. I was coming through the Meta department, far off the tourist routes, a place known for cattle, forests, and long empty stretches of land. I'd stopped at a small riverside village to rest, and one of the locals there pointed me toward a good place to camp, a spot upriver a few kilometers where the trees broke open into an old clearing. It wasn't on any map I had, but I marked the location by hand and set off on foot early that morning. The trail was barely there, mostly a game path, and it took most of the day to find the spot. When I did, I saw what he meant. There was an old, overgrown field, probably a long-abandoned pasture or small farm. The brush had grown back in, but the ground was flat, and you could see where fencing once stood. Off to one side was a collapsed wooden structure, just pieces of timber now, half buried in vines. I set up my hammock between 2 trees near the center of the clearing. It was hot that day, thick with humidity. I took a quick rinse in the nearby creek, then gathered some wood for a fire. The sun fell behind the trees quick and heavy like it does that close to the equator, and darkness settled in faster than I was used to. I got the fire going, had some rice and tuna from my pack, and sat back listening to the jungle. It was loud, frogs, birds, the occasional rustle in the brush. I'd grown used to those noises over the months. They weren't comforting exactly, but they weren't threatening either. Just the background hum of the place. When the fire burned down to embers, I lay in the hammock and watched the sky. That's when I started to whistle. The El Silban whistle. It's just a few notes back and forth, slow and airy, almost like a bird call. I don't know why I did it. Habit, maybe. I told the story so many times that it came naturally. I did it once, twice, then stopped and laughed to myself. The jungle swallowed the sound up quickly. I drifted off soon after. I woke up just past midnight. It was the kind of wake-up that doesn't come from a sound or a dream, just the kind where you go from asleep to completely alert. I stayed still and looked out through the mesh of my hammock netting. The fire was almost gone, just a faint orange glow. The jungle was still loud, but the rhythm had changed. A little off, like one layer of noise had gone missing. I listened harder. Then I heard it. A whistle. Not loud. Soft. Distant. 3 rising notes. Same pattern I'd whistled earlier. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again. Nothing. Then, a minute later, it came again. Still faint. Still distant. Same notes. I sat up in the hammock, slowly unzipped the netting, and looked toward the trees. I couldn't see anything beyond the firelight. I didn't move. I just listened. Another whistle. Same direction. Just a little louder this time. I told myself it was a bird. Maybe a nightjar or something similar. Or maybe one of the locals playing a joke. Maybe someone had followed me. But I hadn't seen another person since I left the village that morning. And they'd have to know the story to mock it like that. The whistle came again. Slightly louder. But now, the jungle was quieter. The frogs had stopped. That's when I realized I wasn't just hearing it louder. I was hearing it closer. Same soft sound, but from a new direction. Further around the edge of the clearing. It circled. Every few minutes, it came again. Each time a little closer. Each time softer. Until finally it was so faint I couldn't tell if it was real or not. Then it stopped. I waited there in the hammock for hours, knife in hand, trying not to breathe too loud. I never saw anything. Nothing moved into the clearing. No shapes, no light, no voice. Just the occasional crack of wood and the sense that something wasn't right. By dawn, I hadn't slept another second. When it was bright enough, I packed my gear fast. I didn't eat. I left the clearing and hiked straight back down the trail I'd come in on. I thought about the whistle the whole way. Told myself again and again it was an animal. Or maybe the wind. I even tried to replicate it with my lips. Maybe I'd heard my own breathing wrong while half asleep. But it didn't match. I reached the village around noon, took a room in a small hospitage near the river, and tried to sleep. That night I stayed inside. There were no windows, just a curtain over an open frame. I pulled it closed tight. Around midnight, I woke up again. Same feeling. Fully awake, no dream, just alert. And outside, through the open window frame, I heard the whistle. This time it was clear, and very, very far away. My breath caught in my chest. I lay there, heart racing. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No more whistles. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I asked the hospitage owner if there were any farmers or cattlemen nearby who sometimes walked at night. He said no. Said most people stayed indoors after dark. I asked if anyone used whistles out in the fields. He shook his head and said no one around there would be out past sunset unless something was wrong. I left that day and took a bus further north, toward more populated areas. I tried to let it go, told myself it was all in my head. But I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. Not alone. Months passed. I returned home, got back into the routine. One night, while camping with friends in the States, someone asked me to tell a spooky story. I pulled out the old favorite, El Silban. I told it the way I always do, but I left something out this time. I didn't whistle. I haven't since. And I still don't know who or what was out there in that clearing with me. But I know this, whatever it wasn't a ghost. It was someone real. Someone who knew that story, knew the whistle, knew how to use it, and they were close enough to hear me, close enough to circle the clearing in silence, close enough to make it feel like the story was coming true. That's the part one don't tell around the campfire anymore. Because that part wasn't a legend. That part really happened.